The Forgotten Island of Death. It begins with a river, a place where time itself seems frozen beneath the Siberian winds. Imagine the vast wilderness of Western Siberia in the early 1930s. Endless stretches of forests, bogs, and frozen rivers. Here, hidden among the twisting arms of the mighty Ob River, lay a small island called Nazino. On a map, it was nothing more than a dot surrounded by swampland. Yet, in the spring of 1933, this insignificant speck of land would earn a name that still chills those who dare to whisper it: Cannibal Island. To understand how thousands of people ended up abandoned there, starving and fighting one another in scenes of unimaginable horror, we must step back into the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. By the early 1930s, Stalin had consolidated power and launched sweeping programs meant to transform the Soviet Union into a modern industrial state. But his revolution of steel and collectivization came at a human cost that defies comprehension. Cities swelled with the homeless, the unemployed, and the so-called socially harmful elements. In Moscow and Leningrad, train stations and markets were crowded with beggars and orphans. Stalin saw them not as victims of his economic upheaval, but as parasites infecting the new socialist order. And so, in 1933, the regime launched a campaign known as the internal deportations. The idea was simple in its cruelty: round up the unwanted, the dispossessed, the petty criminals, and send them to remote areas where they would either become productive colonists or perish. Nazino Island, a swampy outpost with no infrastructure, no homes, no farmland, was chosen as one of these special settlements. It was not prepared for habitation. In truth, it was little more than a prison without walls, a place where the state could dump thousands of unwanted souls and forget them. In May 1933, the first transport began. Eyewitnesses would later recall the moment as if a nightmare had stepped into daylight. Barges, normally used to move timber down the Ob River, were now crammed with human cargo. Between 5,000 and 6,000 men and women, peasants accused of hoarding grain, city beggars, petty thieves, prostitutes, or simply people without proper identification papers, were herded onto the decks like cattle. Guards armed with rifles barked orders, shoving them into tight corners where there was no space to lie down. These people had no idea where they were going. Some were told they were being sent to work colonies with fertile land where they would be given tools and food. Others assumed they were simply being exiled far from the cities. What they did not know was that the authorities had made almost no preparations for their survival. The journey itself was the beginning of their torment. Food was scarce. Some groups received nothing but crusts of black bread during the days-long voyage. Fresh water was almost non-existent. Many were forced to drink straight from the river. Disease spread quickly in the cramped, filthy conditions. The weak collapsed underfoot, trampled as the guards forced more prisoners onto the already overloaded decks. By the time the barges reached their destination, bodies had already been tossed into the Ob. Nazino Island lay ahead, a low, marshy patch of land roughly 2 miles long and less than a mile wide. It had no permanent dwellings, no cultivated soil, and no protection from the biting Siberian winds. The guards forced the deportees ashore with little ceremony. Some stumbled into the mud and immediately sank knee-deep. The place reeked of decay and stagnant water. For many, it was clear from the first step: this was not a settlement. This was a death sentence. At first, the new arrivals tried to cling to hope. They clustered together on the riverbank, waiting for instructions, for tools, for food, for something that would give their ordeal meaning. What they received instead was a paltry ration, a few sacks of raw flour, damp and moldy. There were no ovens, no pots, no utensils, nothing to cook with. Some tried mixing the flour with river water and swallowing the paste, only to collapse hours later with bloated stomachs, dying of dysentery. Others attempted to roast handfuls of flour over campfires, but the flames burned more than they cooked. Hunger gnawed at their insides, and with each passing hour, desperation deepened. The guards offered little help. Their job was not to nurture these people, but to ensure they remained on the island. Armed patrols circled the perimeter, shooting at anyone who tried to swim away. Escape seemed impossible. For the deportees, survival meant finding a way to endure the cold nights with no shelter. Swarms of mosquitoes rising from the bogs, and the constant threat of violence from fellow prisoners who fought over scraps of food. The island soon descended into chaos. Small groups formed, banding together for protection. Stronger prisoners beat the weaker ones to seize their rations of flour. Some guards accepted bribes of valuables in exchange for smuggled food, but most prisoners had nothing left to trade. Those who had been petty criminals in the cities quickly rose to dominance, terrorizing the masses of ordinary peasants and vagrants. The weak, the sick, the elderly, these were the first to perish. By the end of the first week, the island had become a vision of hell. Corpses lay unburied along the riverbanks, their faces twisted in agony. Survivors huddled together, eyes hollow, whispering about food. Rumors spread of darker things happening in the shadows, whispers of people vanishing in the night, their bodies later found with flesh missing. At first, no one wanted to believe it. But as the flour ran out, and as the guards refused to deliver more, the whispers grew louder. Nazino Island was not a colony. It was not even a prison. It was a laboratory of human despair, where hunger stripped away the last layers of civilization. And for those stranded there, the descent into the unthinkable was only just beginning. Stalin's ruthless social cleansing. In 1933, Stalin's Soviet Union was not simply a nation in transition. It was a vast social experiment, and millions of people were its unwilling test subjects. Factories were rising, collective farms were being forced into existence, and the propaganda machine declared that a new socialist paradise was being born. But beneath the surface, chaos festered. Cities were swelling with refugees from the countryside, victims of famine and collectivization. Moscow, Leningrad, Novosibirsk, each urban hub was flooded with hollow-eyed peasants who had lost their land, their homes, and their families. To Stalin, they were more than just a nuisance. They were a threat to the image of order and progress that the regime needed to project. Thus emerged the idea of social cleansing. The secret police, the OGPU, began sweeping the streets, rounding up parasites. Anyone without valid papers could be arrested. A man caught begging on a corner, a woman selling cigarettes without a license, even children sleeping in train stations. All were labeled socially harmful elements. It didn't matter whether they were guilty of anything. Their existence was enough. The numbers were staggering. In the spring of 1933 alone, nearly 2 million people were arrested in these urban sweeps. Some were executed. Many more were sent to the gulag camps that already stretched across Siberia. But not all could be absorbed into the camp system. And so, another solution was devised: deportation to special settlements. The plan was cloaked in the language of productivity. The deportees, the regime claimed, would be sent to fertile but uninhabited regions of Siberia and Kazakhstan. There, they would become farmers, loggers, builders of new socialist towns. On paper, it sounded like a bold colonization project. In reality, it was a cover for mass exile. Among the officials overseeing this policy was Genrikh Yagoda, a rising figure in Stalin's secret police. To Yagoda and his subordinates, the deportations were little more than logistics: move human bodies out of the cities, dump them in the wilderness, and let them fend for themselves. The state would be rid of its undesirables, and any who survived might contribute to the economy. But the bureaucrats underestimated, or perhaps simply ignored, the sheer impossibility of their scheme. Most deportees had no survival skills. They were city dwellers, beggars, orphans, workers torn from factories, petty criminals hardened only by street life. They were given almost no tools, no seeds, no livestock, no real food supply. It was as though the government believed human beings could be planted in the frozen soil like seeds and somehow grow into colonies. Nazino Island was one such destination. Chosen hastily, almost at random, it was meant to house a few thousand deportees as a temporary staging ground. No one prepared shelters. No one delivered livestock or tools. When the first barges arrived in May 1933, the island was little more than swamp and forest, surrounded by freezing waters. The cruelty of the system was not an accident. Stalin's vision of society demanded the elimination of weakness, and the deportations became a way to achieve it. Those who survived would prove their worth. Those who perished were simply the waste products of history. Back in the cities, propaganda portrayed the deportations as opportunities. Posters showed smiling peasants building homes in the wilderness, axes raised high, sun shining above them. Citizens were told that the resettlers were pioneers, carrying socialism to the farthest reaches of the land. No one in Moscow saw the barges crammed with the desperate, the sick, the starving. No one in Leningrad saw the mud, the mosquitoes, the rotting flour. Inside the island, however, the truth became brutally clear. The deportees were not pioneers. They were prisoners, cast adrift in an environment designed to kill them. And Stalin's machine was not concerned with their suffering. Among the prisoners themselves, the line between victim and predator began to blur. Former thieves and criminals, hardened by years in Moscow's underground, quickly realized that brute strength and intimidation would ensure survival. They organized gangs, seizing the flour rations, extorting weaker prisoners, and enforcing their own twisted order. For the peasants and beggars, survival meant clinging together in small groups, hiding scraps of food, building makeshift shelters of branches and mud. But nothing could protect them from hunger. Every day the island consumed more lives. Every day the swamp claimed more bodies. And yet the guards still patrolled, still barked orders, still fired shots at those who tried to escape. The deportees had become something less than human in the eyes of their overseers. They were raw material to be discarded, a problem pushed out of sight and out of mind. As weeks passed, the line between desperation and madness began to disappear. The deportees no longer thought in terms of tomorrow or next week. They thought only of the next mouthful of food. And when food no longer existed, they began to look at each other differently. Whispers of cannibalism spread across Nazino Island like a sickness. At first, they were just rumors, fragments of conversations, stories too terrible to be true. But then bodies began to appear with flesh missing. Eyewitnesses recalled people vanishing into the night and being found the next day mutilated. Guards themselves later testified that women were tied to trees and cut apart by starving gangs. Nazino Island was no longer just a failed colony. It had become something darker, something primal, something that revealed the very limits of humanity. And as the summer of 1933 approached, the name Cannibal Island was seared into the memories of all who lived and died there. The descent into madness. On Nazino Island, time lost all meaning. Days blended into nights, hunger blurred into pain, and the endless buzzing of mosquitoes became a background chorus to human misery. Survivors later described those weeks as a living nightmare, where every hour was marked by fear, fear of starvation, fear of violence, fear of becoming someone else's next meal. At first, the deportees clung to a fragile sense of order. Small groups formed, makeshift shelters rose from branches and wet grass, and people tried to ration what little flour they had left. But the flour was gone within days. Some had eaten it raw, mixing it with river water until their bellies swelled with deadly paste. Others tried cooking it in tin cans or on flat stones over smoky fires. Diarrhea and dysentery swept through the camp. The stench of human waste and unburied bodies filled the humid summer air. The guards delivered no more supplies. They stood on the riverbanks, rifles in hand, watching the chaos unfold. One survivor later recalled, "They treated us like cattle, only worse. At least cattle are given grass to eat." When the flour ran out, panic set in. Some prisoners tried foraging in the swampy forest that lined the island. They dug up roots, gnawed on bark, and chewed grass until their mouths bled. But Nazino was no paradise. It offered nothing that could sustain thousands of starving people. Every step into the bog risked being swallowed whole by the earth itself. Then came the violence. Gangs of hardened criminals who had dominated the flour rations now turned to terror. They beat the weak, robbed them of clothing, and seized whatever scraps they found. Women became currency. Guards looked the other way, or joined in the abuse. Eyewitnesses recalled women traded for bread crusts or forced into brutal protection by the gangs. But even violence could not fill empty stomachs. Hunger drove the deportees beyond sanity. The first act of cannibalism was whispered about in hushed tones, dismissed as a rumor. But soon, evidence appeared. A body was found with strips of flesh missing from its thighs. Then another, and another. Panic spread, not just of starving, but of becoming prey. Prisoners began to fear the night. They huddled in groups, terrified that shadows moving in the dark were not wolves, but fellow humans hunting for flesh. Some prisoners armed themselves with sticks or sharpened branches, not to ward off animals, but to fight cannibals. One witness, a guard named Kostia, later testified, "At night people disappeared. In the morning we would find them cut apart. I saw a woman tied to a tree, her legs and breasts cut off while she was still alive. The others ate her." The horror spread like an infection. Once the taboo was broken, more followed. The dead became food, and then the living. People were attacked, strangled, or lured away into the forest. Flesh was roasted over fires. The smell of burning meat mingled with the stench of decay. Some cannibals were executed by the guards, shot as examples. But their corpses were left on the ground, and in the frenzy of starvation even their flesh was stripped. Death and consumption became a cycle, feeding one upon the other. Not everyone succumbed. There were those who resisted, who fought desperately to hold on to their humanity. Small groups formed around individuals who refused to cross the line. They buried the dead, guarded the weak, and prayed for rescue. Yet even they were haunted by the sight of others roasting human flesh. For many, the line between survival and damnation became too thin to hold. By midsummer, Nazino was littered with corpses. Hundreds had died of starvation, disease, or violence. Many more had been consumed. Out of nearly 6,000 deportees sent to the island, fewer than 2,000 would survive the ordeal. But for the survivors, survival was not a victory. It was a wound that never healed. They carried the memories with them for life, the screams, the smell, the sight of neighbors reduced to food. Years later, one survivor confessed, "We lived like animals. No, worse than animals. Animals do not eat each other like we did." Back in Moscow, the authorities knew. Reports filtered in from guards, local officials, even doctors sent to examine the survivors. They described scenes of horror, of cannibalism, of mass death. But the regime buried the truth. Stalin's government called the experiment a failure and quietly moved survivors to other camps.
Nazino Island was erased from official records, its story silenced for decades. Yet memory is not so easily erased. Whispers of the Cannibal Island lingered among survivors, among guards, among the few who dared to tell the truth. And decades later, when the Soviet Union began to crumble, the story finally emerged. Raw, terrifying, and unforgettable.
Nazino Island had shown what happens when a government sees its people not as human beings, but as disposable parts of an experiment. It was not just a failure of policy. It was a revelation of how thin the line is between civilization and savagery. And in 1933, on that forgotten island, the line was crossed. Survivors and testimonies. When the nightmare of Nazino finally loosened its grip, only fragments of humanity remained on the island. Corpses lay scattered in the mud, their faces twisted in hunger, their bodies bearing the marks of violence and consumption. Out of nearly 6,000 people, fewer than 2,000 survived. But even survival came with scars that no passage of time could heal. The Soviet government wanted silence. Local officials were ordered to bury the story. Guards who had witnessed the horror were reassigned, and reports were marked classified. But memories cannot be ordered away. Survivors, officials, and even sympathetic guards began to whisper. Decades later, these whispers became testimonies. haunting, unflinching accounts of what really happened on Cannibal Island. One survivor, a woman named Maria, later told investigators, "We thought we were being resettled. We carried what we could: clothes, pots, children. Then the soldiers took everything. They said, 'You won't need these on the island.' They left us naked in the cold, with nothing but sacks of flour. I watched my husband die first, then my son. By the third week, I had nothing left to bury them with. Only the mosquitoes knew our grief." Another account came from a young man who had been just 17 at the time. He recalled, "When they gave us flour, the strong took it all. I tried to beg, but they laughed. I drank water mixed with flour until my stomach swelled. Then the gangs came. They beat me and stripped me of my boots. I was lucky. They left me alive. Others were not so lucky." Guards themselves confessed to horrors they could not forget. Kostia, one of the soldiers stationed on the island, admitted, "We were told to keep order, but what order could exist? We had no food for them, no supplies. We watched them eat grass, bark, even each other. I remember shooting a man who had killed another for meat. His body was left where it fell. The next day, it too had been eaten." Perhaps the most chilling testimony came from a local official named Vasily Velichko, who was sent to investigate Nazino shortly after the deportees arrived. In his secret report to Moscow, he described scenes that could only be called hellish. "I saw people with pieces of human flesh in their hands. One woman confessed to me with tears that she had eaten her own child to survive. Another was found tied to a tree, her body mutilated, her breasts and muscles cut away. The smell of smoke and human flesh filled the air. Never in my life had I imagined such a thing." Velichko's report was sent directly to higher authorities. It confirmed cannibalism, mass death, and catastrophic failure of the resettlement plan. But the Soviet leadership did not punish those who ordered the deportations. Instead, the report was buried in archives, marked top secret. Stalin himself likely never read it. For decades, the world knew nothing of the horrors of Nazino. For the survivors, silence was its own prison. Many never spoke of what they had seen, carrying the shame in secret. Those who did share their stories often faced disbelief, or worse, accusations of spreading lies against the Soviet Union. One man who testified in the 1940s was later denounced as a traitor. His testimony vanished into state files. Yet time has a way of forcing truth into the open. In the 1980s, as the Soviet Union began to crumble, historians and journalists unearthed Velichko's long-buried report. Survivors who were still alive finally had the chance to tell their stories without fear of execution. What emerged was a portrait of unimaginable cruelty, not just of starvation and cannibalism, but of deliberate dehumanization by a government that saw its people as disposable. One historian later wrote, "Nazino was not an accident. It was the product of a system that treated human lives as tools. When the tools broke, they were discarded. On that island, the state revealed its truest face. Even now, the testimonies remain difficult to read. They are filled with trembling voices, half-remembered details, and tears that never dried. Survivors described nightmares that haunted them for decades. The cries of the dying, the sight of neighbors devouring flesh, the endless buzzing of mosquitoes as they tried to sleep among the corpses. But their words matter. Without them, the story of Cannibal Island might have been lost forever, erased by a regime that specialized in burying the truth. Through these voices, the dead of Nazino speak again, not just as victims of starvation, but as witnesses to the depths of human suffering. The testimonies also force us to confront a terrible question. How far can people be pushed before civilization collapses? On Nazino, that question was answered, and it was answered in blood. The bureaucracy of death. How Nazino was conceived. Every catastrophe has an origin, not just in the hunger of the people or the violence of the mob, but in the quiet, polished offices where decisions are made with pens instead of guns. The tragedy of Nazino was not born on the island itself. It was born hundreds of miles away in Moscow, in the vast machinery of Stalin's Soviet bureaucracy. In the early 1930s, the Soviet Union was gripped by a frenzy of transformation. Stalin's 5-year plans demanded industrial growth at any cost. Cities swelled with workers, but alongside them came the so-called unreliables, peasants who had fled famine-stricken villages, petty criminals, beggars, and anyone deemed unwilling to fit the new Soviet order. To Stalin's government, they were a threat to progress. The solution was social cleansing. In 1933, the Politburo approved a sweeping operation to rid Moscow and Leningrad of parasites. Police rounded up tens of thousands of people: drifters, the homeless, petty thieves, even those who simply lacked proper identification papers. Overnight, they became enemies of the state. But where to put them? The Gulag camps were already overcrowded. The prisons were bursting. Officials proposed an idea that seemed neat, efficient, and terrifying: special settlements. Remote areas of Siberia and Kazakhstan would be filled with deportees who would transform the wilderness into thriving colonies. It was colonization by force, exiling the unwanted to tame the land. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, it was madness. Enter Genrikh Yagoda, the deputy head of the secret police, OGPU. He championed the plan, promising Stalin that these labor settlements would both cleanse the cities and provide cheap manpower for Siberian development. Bureaucrats drew up lists, quotas, and timetables. Within weeks, trains began moving eastward, packed not with volunteers, but with the condemned poor. Nazino was not chosen with care. It was simply convenient. A speck of land in the Ob River, isolated, unreachable, and, most importantly, far away from Moscow. To the officials, it was a blank space on the map, perfect for dumping social waste. Few asked whether the island had resources to sustain thousands of people. Few cared. The paperwork was cold, clinical. Deportees were categorized as contingents. Food rations were calculated with numbers, not human stomachs. Supplies were ordered in theory, but never delivered in practice. Guards were assigned, not to protect the settlers, but to control them. From the moment the first train left Moscow, the fate of the deportees was sealed. One memorandum, discovered decades later, revealed the chilling detachment of the system. Deliver 6,000 contingents to Nazino Island, flour rations to be distributed, no additional supplies required. That was it. Thousands of lives reduced to a single paragraph. The chain of command was a labyrinth. Local officials in Tomsk received orders but no resources. The OGPU provided guards but not logistics. The commissars in Moscow assumed everything was under control, while field officers struggled with chaos. Responsibility was so fragmented that no one felt accountable. Each layer of bureaucracy pushed the burden downward, until it landed on the island itself, on the shoulders of starving, dispossessed people who had never even chosen to be there. What is most disturbing is that Nazino was not an accident in the eyes of the system. It was a calculated risk. If thousands perished, the state would not mourn them. They were class enemies, parasites, disposable. Their deaths were acceptable collateral in the grand project of building socialism. Historians later argued that this bureaucratic detachment was as deadly as any weapon. The cannibalism on Nazino was born from starvation, but the starvation was born from paperwork, from the cold logic of officials who never set foot on the island. Stalin did not need to pull a trigger. The forms signed in Moscow were enough to unleash hell. To the survivors, this was the deepest cruelty of all. They had not died in war or in some natural disaster, but in an experiment conceived by men in suits who never looked them in the eyes. As one survivor bitterly said decades later, "We were not people to them. We were numbers on a page. Numbers can be erased." Nazino, in this light, was not just a tragedy. It was a revelation of the Soviet state itself, a machine that could grind thousands of human beings into dust without a second thought, and then file the incident away as if it had never happened. Silence and cover-up. When the last survivors were ferried away from Nazino, the island was left behind like a rotting wound on the Siberian landscape. Bodies lay unburied, bones scattered along the riverbanks, shallow pits filled with decomposed flesh. The mosquitoes continued their endless hum, feeding on the dead as easily as they had on the living. But for the Soviet government, Nazino was not a tragedy. It was an embarrassment, and embarrassments had to be buried. Almost immediately, local officials began filing reports. The district authorities in Tomsk sent desperate telegrams to Moscow, describing chaos, starvation, and cannibalism. One officer, unable to soften the horror, wrote bluntly, "The settlement experiment has collapsed. The deportees are dying in large numbers. Cannibalism is widespread. Urgent action required." In a normal world, such words would have sparked outrage, investigations, and accountability. But Stalin's Soviet Union was not a normal world. It was a world where failure could not exist, where every disaster was either an enemy's sabotage or a problem to be quietly erased. The OGPU, embarrassed by the fiasco, moved quickly to control the narrative. Officially, Nazino was described as a resettlement operation with unforeseen difficulties. No mention of cannibalism, no mention of mass death. Instead, the document spoke of supply shortages, disciplinary problems, and unprepared terrain. Bureaucratic euphemisms replaced the screams of the starving. Investigators like Vasily Velichko, whose secret report vividly described cannibalism, were pressured into silence. His findings were classified, locked away in archives that no ordinary citizen would ever see. For decades, his report gathered dust in the vaults of the Soviet state, hidden behind layers of secrecy. Survivors who spoke of what they had seen risked being accused of anti-Soviet propaganda. In a society where truth itself was dangerous, silence became the only form of survival. Many never spoke a word to their children or grandchildren. They carried the memory privately, like a poison in their veins. Even the guards who witnessed the horrors kept quiet. Some were reassigned to other camps, others promoted, others vanished into the machinery of the Gulag system. None faced trial. None were held accountable. To Moscow, Nazino was not a crime, it was a lesson. And what was that lesson? That human beings could be erased not only physically, but historically. The dead of Nazino were denied graves, denied dignity, and denied memory. They were swallowed by silence, their suffering recorded only in secret files. It was not until the late 1980s, as the Soviet Union began to collapse under the weight of its contradictions, that the silence cracked. Glasnost, the new policy of openness, allowed historians and journalists to finally unearth the hidden past. Velichko's report surfaced, yellowed with age but burning with truth. Survivors, now old and frail, stepped forward to tell their stories at last. Their words shocked the world. Newspapers printed headlines about the Cannibal Island, and readers reeled in disbelief. Could such a thing really have happened in the 20th century, in the heart of a modern state? The testimonies, the reports, the very bones found on Nazino said yes, it had happened, and it had been hidden for more than 50 years. The cover-up was as much a crime as the event itself. By burying the truth, the Soviet state condemned generations to ignorance. Only at the twilight of its existence did the truth emerge, and by then, most of the perpetrators were long dead. Justice was impossible. Only memory remained. One historian later wrote, "The tragedy of Nazino was doubled, first by the horror itself, then by the silence that followed. In both, the state triumphed over humanity. Yet silence cannot erase everything. The earth remembers, the island remembers, and thanks to the voices of survivors, so do we." Life after Nazino. The survivor's burden. When the survivors of Nazino were finally ferried away from the island, their ordeal did not end. The Soviet Union had little interest in rescuing them, and even less in healing them. To the state, they were still criminals, still socially harmful elements, still bodies to be used, discarded, or hidden. But to themselves, they were shadows, haunted by memories of starvation, madness, and the unspeakable choices made on that patch of land. Many were sent to labor camps deep in Siberia. Exhausted, malnourished, and broken in spirit, they were herded into barracks of the Gulag system. Life there was not freedom, but a slower death. If Nazino had been a storm of horror, the Gulag was a long, cold winter. Prisoners cut timber in freezing forests, mined coal in choking dust, or built railroads across frozen swamps. The stronger ones survived. The weaker ones vanished into unmarked graves. Some deportees managed to slip away into Siberian villages, where sympathetic peasants quietly gave them food or work. But even in safety, they carried Nazino with them. They spoke in hushed tones of what they had seen: bones cracked for marrow, human flesh traded like currency, the screams of those dragged into the bushes at night. For many, silence was the only refuge. Better to forget than to risk madness. But forgetting was impossible. Survivors often dreamed of the island. One woman later recalled that she woke night after night hearing the sound of chewing, the phantom echo of cannibalism. Another survivor described how she could not look at meat without feeling nauseous. A man who had stolen food on Nazino confessed decades later that he had never forgiven himself. Guilt, shame, and terror became lifelong companions. Children of survivors noticed the scars too. Some grew up with parents who refused to speak of the past, yet lived with sudden fits of anger or despair. Others inherited fragments of the story, told in whispers after too much vodka, stories cut short by tears. In these families, Nazino was a ghost at the table, unseen but always present. The community of survivors never gathered, never organized. How could they? In the Soviet Union, speaking about Nazino meant admitting to being a deportee, a criminal, an enemy of the people. It was dangerous. Instead, survivors blended into the silence of Soviet life. They worked in factories, farms, or mines, their past erased by necessity. Some even convinced themselves it had been a nightmare, something too monstrous to be real. And yet, memory has its own stubborn life. In the 1980s, when Glasnost opened the door to long-suppressed truths, some of the old survivors spoke. Their voices trembled, but their words carried the weight of decades. They told of the first days when bread was thrown to the crowd like scraps to animals. They told of the guards who shot anyone too weak to move. They told of human flesh roasted over campfires. One survivor, then in his 70s, whispered, "We ate to live, but living became a punishment. I never stopped seeing their faces." Psychologists would later describe what these survivors endured as a form of concentrated trauma, similar to Holocaust survivors or those who endured famine in Ukraine. But the Soviet Union had no therapy, no recognition, no compassion. Instead, survivors endured silently, carrying invisible wounds. The burden was not only psychological, it was also moral. Some had stolen food from the dying. Some had struck others down to survive. Some had eaten what was unthinkable. When they looked in the mirror years later, they asked themselves, "What did I become?" Survival carried its own curse. Nazino did not just take lives, it warped the lives it spared. Survivors lived in two worlds, the visible Soviet world of work, family, and patriotic slogans, and the hidden inner world of the island, where civilization had collapsed and humans had become prey. The distance between these worlds could never be closed. Decades later, when historians pieced together the story, they found that the survivors' testimonies were often fragmented. A detail here, a memory there, always interrupted by silence. Sometimes the silence said more than words ever could. It was the silence of unbearable truth. To live after Nazino was to live with memory as both curse and duty. Survivors carried the past not only for themselves, but for the dead who could not speak. In their trembling voices, the world finally heard what had been buried for so long. But their burden was not only personal, it was historical. The story of Nazino forced the world to confront a question. What happens when a state treats human beings not as citizens, but as disposable matter? And what happens to those few who crawl out alive from such a place? The answers were written not only in archives, but in the haunted eyes of the survivors. They were living witnesses that civilization is far more fragile than we want to believe, and that once it cracks, the descent into barbarism can be terrifyingly swift. The island today, traces of horror. Natsino Island still lies in the middle of the Ob River, a strip of low, marshy land surrounded by dark forests and endless sky. At first glance, it looks ordinary, just another forgotten corner of Siberia, covered in grass, birch trees, and swarms of mosquitoes. But those who know its story say the ground itself feels heavy, as if it remembers. When historians and journalists began returning to Natsino in the late 1980s and early 1990s, they were struck by the silence. The wind rustled through reeds, the river lapped against the muddy shore. But beneath that calm was an eerie sense of absence. An island that once held thousands of desperate people now stood empty, abandoned, almost untouched by time. Yet the traces of horror remained. Archaeologists uncovered shallow pits filled with bones, human bones, some cracked open, some charred by fire. They found remnants of makeshift shelters, thin layers of ash and scraps of rusted metal. The evidence was fragile but undeniable. This was not just a campsite, it was a graveyard. Locals spoke of the island in whispers. Fishermen avoided its shores, claiming that bad luck followed anyone who lingered there too long. Hunters told stories of strange noises at night, the cries of people long dead, carried on the wind. Some said the island was cursed, that no plant grew well there, that animals refused to nest. Whether superstition or truth, the aura of Natsino kept people away. For those who dared to set foot, the weight of the past was overwhelming. Journalists described walking across the grass and feeling as if the earth itself was hollow, filled with secrets it did not want to share. One researcher wrote, "Every step felt like stepping on the edge of a wound. The silence screamed louder than any voice." The Soviet archives confirmed what the island revealed. Velichko's report, once locked away, detailed everything: starvation, cannibalism, the failure of the experiment. With those words in hand, standing on Natsino felt like standing in two times at once, the present and the nightmare of 1933. Memorial crosses were eventually erected on the island, simple wooden markers standing against the Siberian sky. They are not elaborate monuments, just reminders that the dead should not be forgotten. Yet few visit them. Natsino is not a place of pilgrimage. It is a place of warning, a scar in the landscape that resists closure. Even now, when the river floods, bones sometimes rise from the soil, carried downstream by the current. Farmers have found fragments of skulls lodged in the mud. These grim reminders show that history does not always stay buried. The island continues to give up its dead, as if refusing silence. For descendants of survivors, Natsino is a wound passed down through generations. Some travel to the island to stand on the ground where their relatives suffered. They describe feeling chills, as if the air itself carried whispers. Others cannot bring themselves to go, preferring to honor the memory from afar. The island today is both a physical place and a symbol. It represents the cruelty of a state that reduced human beings to numbers, shipped them like cattle, and left them to starve. It represents the fragility of civilization, the ease with which society can collapse into savagery. And it represents memory, the stubborn fact that even the most carefully buried secrets can resurface. To walk on Natsino is to feel history pressing in, not as words on a page, but as presence in the air. The reeds sway like 1,000 thin voices. The water reflects a sky that once looked down on suffering, and the earth holds what remains of those who never left. In that silence, one truth becomes clear. The island is not just a grave, it is a witness, and witnesses do not forget. Lessons from Cannibal Island. What history warns us? History often whispers, but sometimes it screams. The story of Natsino Island is one of those screams, too brutal, too raw, too horrifying to ignore. And yet, for decades, it was buried under silence. Today, as we look back, the question is not only what happened, but what it means for us now. The first lesson is about the fragility of civilization. On the banks of the Ob River, thousands of ordinary people, farmers, workers, beggars, men and women, were stripped of food, shelter, and dignity. Within days, they descended into chaos. Neighbors turned against each other. The strongest preyed on the weakest. Families broke apart. Cannibalism, unthinkable in normal life, became the only option for survival. Nazino teaches us that beneath the thin surface of order lies something darker. Civilization is not guaranteed. It is built on trust, shared values, and the stability of society. Remove those, and human beings can unravel frighteningly fast. It is a warning not just about the past, but about the present. Any society that believes itself immune to collapse is already in danger. The second lesson is about power. Stalin's regime did not send people to Nazino because it lacked resources. It did so because it valued control more than life. The deportations were not about helping the homeless, but about removing undesirables. Bureaucrats filled quotas, trains moved east, and human beings were reduced to statistics. The state created the island not by accident, but by indifference. This indifference is perhaps the most chilling part. No one on the ground wanted to kill thousands of people in such a way, but no one cared enough to stop it either. Orders were followed, forms stamped, prisoners shipped. The lesson here is that atrocities do not always come from monsters. They come from ordinary people obeying systems without question. They come from silence, from those who see suffering and look away. The third lesson is about memory. For 50 years, Nazino was hidden. Survivors were silenced, witnesses ignored, archives sealed. But truth has a way of surfacing. Bones rose from the soil. Stories slipped through the cracks, and once revealed, the memory could not be erased. In this way, the island warns us. Forgetting is dangerous. A society that buries its crimes does not escape them. It only plants seeds for repetition. To confront history is painful, but denial is fatal. There is also a personal lesson hidden in Nazino. What would you do, placed on that island? Would you share your crust of bread? Would you fight for survival at all costs? Or would you collapse into despair? We like to think of ourselves as strong, moral, civilized. But Nazino strips away illusions. It shows us that survival is not only about strength of body, but strength of spirit. Finally, the story of Cannibal Island is not just about the Soviet Union. It is about human nature and political systems everywhere. Whenever a government treats people as disposable, whenever bureaucracies place rules above humanity, whenever indifference outweighs compassion, another Nazino becomes possible. The form may change, the place may change, but the lesson is eternal. Cruelty thrives when compassion dies. Standing on the edge of Nazino, you can almost hear the voices of the dead. They are not just whispering about their own suffering. They are warning us, remember us, do not repeat us. And so, the island becomes not just a tragedy, but a mirror.
It reflects back our capacity for both evil and endurance, both cruelty and resilience. The question is not whether history will remember Nazino. The question is whether we will learn from it.
The legacy of Nazino. Why the world must remember. On a lonely island in Siberia, thousands of voices were silenced. No monuments bore their names. No families received their remains. No official histories marked their passing. For decades, they lay in shallow graves, forgotten by the world that abandoned them. But the silence of Nazino Island is not empty. It is heavy, filled with the weight of those who suffered. And today, we must decide whether that silence becomes a warning or a shadow. Nazino is not just a place. It is a scar, a reminder that progress and cruelty can walk hand in hand, that human beings, when stripped of food, shelter, and hope, can become both victims and predators, that a state, when blinded by ideology and power, can sacrifice its people without hesitation. The legacy of Cannibal Island is written in bones, in forgotten reports, in the whispers of survivors who lived long enough to tell their stories. And those stories are not just history, they are mirrors. They show us what happens when human life loses its value, when bureaucracy replaces compassion, when obedience is prized above conscience. To the descendants of the victims, Nazino is personal. It is the face of a grandmother lost, an uncle vanished, a family tree broken. To the rest of us, it is universal. It is a warning that no nation, no people, no time is immune to cruelty. We may tell ourselves, it cannot happen here, but history answers, it already has, and it can again. This is why remembering matters. Memory is more than history, it is resistance. To remember Nazino is to refuse silence, to deny indifference, to hold the powerful accountable. It is to honor the nameless dead, not as statistics, but as people who laughed, loved, dreamed, and then were cast into hell. And so, we must speak their names, even if we do not know them. We must tell their story, even if it chills us. Because forgetting is the final victory of those who cause their suffering. And remembering is the only gift we can offer the dead. When the wind blows across the Ob River, when the reeds whisper on Nazino's shore, it is said you can feel the weight of history pressing in. Perhaps those are the voices of the lost, reminding us of one simple truth, that the measure of a society is not in its monuments or its power, but in how it treats the most vulnerable. Nazino failed that test, but we do not have to. This is the legacy of Cannibal Island, not just a tragedy of the past, but a warning for the future. A reminder that the line between humanity and horror is thinner than we dare believe. And above all, a plea that echoes through time. Remember us. Do not let it happen again.